Okay, let's test our knowledge. So let's start off just the basics. Let's name the four large biological molecules or biomolecules that we talked about. So that was going to be then our carbohydrates, our lipids, our nucleic acids, and proteins. Now let's delve a little deeper. Which of these contain carbon? So remember at the beginning of our conversation for organic molecules, we said that we were going to focus on organic molecules, and organic molecules contain both carbon and hydrogen. And I told you guys that all the biomolecules that we discussed would actually be organic molecules. So all of them actually contain carbon. All right, what about hydrogen? Well, they all have to contain hydrogen in order to be organic molecules, right? Yep, that's correct. So what about nitrogen? So let's think about nitrogen. Which ones had nitrogen? So if you remember, our DNA and RNA had or were made up of nucleotides, right? And so nucleotides had the phosphate group, they had the sugar attached to it. Oh, can't spell tonight. And then they also had the nitrogenous base, and they were given the name nitrogenous base because they contain nitrogen. So DNA and RNA fall under this category. And then also, if you remember, proteins were made up of a central carbon that was attached to an amino group, which had a nitrogen and two hydrogens, and then also had a hydrogen attached to it, and then a carboxyl group attached to it. And then the differences in those amino acids were those R groups. So we have nitrogen here for proteins, and then we have nitrogenous bases associated with both DNA and RNA. So proteins and nucleic acids then is our answer. Which of them contain sulfur? Do you guys remember? So actually, we talked a little bit about it when we talked about protein structure, more specifically talked about tertiary protein structure, and they could form disulfide bridges. So those are sulfur to sulfur covalent bonds. So we actually only find sulfur in our proteins when we look at the biomolecules, in our standard biomolecules. All right, so our cell membranes, aka plasma membranes, they're mainly composed of what? Now remember, those are going to be forming those bilayers. They're amphiphasic molecules. So that's going to be phospholipids. Okay, so here's kind of an analytical question. So assume E. coli are grown in a nutrient media containing the radioisotope 16N. After a 48-hour incubation period, the 16N would most likely be found in E. coli's what? Okay, so now this looks a little scary because you're like, oh gosh, what the heck, radioisotope. Okay, so just need you to know that when E. coli grow, they take stuff from the media, like atoms, in from the media, and they incorporate that into new cell pieces and parts, because remember, matter cannot be created nor destroyed, so it actually has to take the molecules from the media and then incorporate those into the new cellular components it's growing. So this is basically just a fancy way of asking you all which one of E. coli's large biological molecules, or which one of these choices, contain nitrogen. Okay, so we already answered this actually. So we know carbohydrates, they have the formula CXH2XOX. So there's no nitrogen there. Lipids, we see mostly carbon, hydrogen, some oxygens here and there. So we know that that's not correct. We know that the molecular formula for water is H2O, so that can't be correct. Now, by process of elimination, it has to be proteins, but remember, proteins are made up of amino acids who have the central carbon with the amino group, the hydrogen, and the carboxyl group, and then the R group. So there's your nitrogen. So that's where it would be incorporated. So our answer then is proteins. All right, similar question, except this time we're growing our E. coli in a fancy media that has 32P. So which of the following would we find then that 32P incorporated? So again, this is just a fancy way of asking which of these contain phosphorus atom. So ATP is a molecule that contains, it's the precursor to our nucleotides. It has 3 phosphate groups, and the phosphate groups contain a phosphorus. So yeah, that's actually a pretty good answer. When we take a look at, oh, sorry, we're asking, be found in all of the following molecules except, ooh, almost got myself. So except. So yes, we know that phosphate is found in ATP, so that phosphorus is there. Carbohydrates. Again, carbohydrates has the CXH2XOX. Do we have phosphate there? No, we don't. So that might be a potential answer. Let's keep going. Just check. DNA we know is made up of nucleotides, which have a phosphate group, a sugar, and then that nitrogenous base attached to it. So there's our phosphorus. So that, yes, has a phosphorus. The plasma membrane made up of phospholipids, and those phospholipids have a phosphate attached to their heads. So there's your phosphorus. And so none of the above will actually, we know that carbohydrates don't have the phosphorus. So that is actually the answer. What type of macromolecule or biomolecule is not considered a polymer? So let's go through them. Our carbohydrates are made up of monomers or simple sugars. Our proteins are made up of amino acids that are pieced together. And then our nucleic acids are polymers of nucleotides. So the only one that we talked about that wasn't actually a polymer, but actually had different categories associated with it was actually our lipids. All right, what are our nucleotides associated with DNA? So we're going to find A's, C's, and G's in both DNA and RNA, but what's that unique one for DNA? If you answer thymine, you're correct. So that one's found in our DNA. And then what about the nucleotides of RNA? So we know A's, C's, and G's for RNA, and then no thymine in RNA. Instead, we find uracil. And what are the 3 components of ATP? So that's going to be our phosphate groups, our ribose sugar, and then adenine, the nitrogenous base. So please let me know if you have any questions on that. If not, go ahead and complete your mastering assignment for Chapter 2.